The report said blunt force trauma to the left temporal region and listed the weapon as a brass candlestick, approximately 14 inches, removed from the mantelpiece of the study. Detective Inspector Colworth had written this in his neat, slightly too small handwriting, and Miss Jane Hartley was reading it over his shoulder because he had forgotten she was standing there. She often had that effect on people. "You'll want to sit down, Miss Hartley," Colworth said, noticing her at last. He said it the way men said things to women of a certain age, kindly and without much thought. "I'm perfectly comfortable," she said, and went on reading. Gerald Frome, 53 years old. Found by his housemaid, a Mrs. Edith Poole, at approximately 7:15 Wednesday morning, when she arrived to lay the breakfast fire, and found the study door open and Gerald Frome on the floor beside his desk, with his head at an angle that told her, before she looked properly, that something was very wrong. Time of death estimated between 8 and 11 Tuesday evening. The brass candlestick had been wiped, not thoroughly, Colworth had noted, as though someone had grabbed whatever was near and rubbed quickly, and left on the floor near the body, rather than replaced on the mantelpiece. That last detail interested Miss Jane. She straightened up and looked around the small reception room of Cranswick's police station, which smelled of damp wool and the particular mustiness of old forms filed and never retrieved. Is Colworth's constable, a young man named Briggs who looked as though he had only recently been allowed to shave, was writing something at the front desk. Outside, November fog pressed itself against the windows. Miss Jane had come to the station for a perfectly ordinary reason. She had found on her morning walk a small brown dog sitting in the middle of Church Lane with no collar and an expression of profound confusion, and she had brought it to Briggs because she didn't know whose it was and couldn't very well leave it there. She had been about to go home. She had onions on the stove when Arthur Pendleton had walked through the door. She knew Arthur vaguely. Most people in Cranswick knew most other people vaguely. He was a quiet man, middle 50s, who rented Larkspur Cottage on the east end of the village from Gerald Frome, and worked, or had worked, as an accounts clerk for a firm in Norwich that she believed had recently let him go. He had a wife, Vera, who sang in the church choir and made excellent Victoria sponge, and had the slightly too bright smile of a woman managing something privately difficult. Arthur had come in wearing new shoes. This was not by itself remarkable. What was remarkable was everything else about him. The way he stood just inside the door for a moment before approaching the desk, as though confirming a decision already made. The way his hands were still at his sides rather than fidgeting. The way he looked at Briggs and said clearly and without preamble, "I need to speak with whoever is in charge. I've come to confess to the murder of Gerald Frome." Briggs stared at him. Arthur waited. Miss Jane, standing to one side with her coat buttoned and her gloves in her hand, looked at Arthur Pendleton's shoes. Brown leather, unmarked, the slight stiffness at the toe of a pair not yet worn in, and thought he dressed for this. Colworth interviewed Arthur in the back room. Miss Jane, by a small miracle of oversight, and the fact that she had sat down in the chair nearest the corridor and opened her bag as though looking for something, heard most of it through the inadequately thick wall. Arthur's voice was steady throughout. Almost too steady. The steadiness of a man who has been practicing in the mirror, she thought. Though that was perhaps unkind. His story was this: Gerald Frome had been his landlord for 11 years. In that time, that Gerald had raised the rent on Larkspur Cottage 4 times, had refused twice to repair the roof, and had lent Arthur money 18 months ago, when Arthur had lost his position at the Norwich firm, at an interest rate that Arthur now understood to be, in plain terms, ruinous. He had gone to Gerald on Tuesday evening to ask for an extension. Gerald had refused. More than refused, had said something, apparently, about what he would do if the payments didn't resume by the end of the month. They had argued. Arthur had picked up the candlestick from the mantelpiece and struck him. "What time was this?" Colworth asked. "I arrived at 9. I was there perhaps 20 minutes. "And after?" "I walked home." "Did anyone see you?" A pause. "I don't believe so. It was foggy." "And the candlestick, you left it?" "I wiped it and left it. I wasn't thinking clearly." Another pause, longer. Then Colworth's voice. "Mr. Pendleton, I have to tell you this is somewhat unusual. Most people don't simply walk in and—" "I know," Arthur said, "but I did it. I want to be honest about it." The word honest sat in the air for a moment. Miss Jane heard Colworth shift in his chair. "Right," Colworth said. "Well, we'll need a formal statement." She was still in her chair when they brought Arthur through to process him. He looked at her as he passed, just briefly, and she gave him the small, mild smile she gave everyone, the sort of smile people looked straight through. He looked through it. His expression didn't change. Colworth came out a few minutes later and seemed genuinely surprised to find her still there. "Miss Hartley, can I—" "I'm just going," she said, standing. "I only wanted to ask, did the candlestick, was it left near the body or near the door?" Colworth looked at her. "Near the body. Why?" "No reason, just curious." She pulled on her gloves. He wiped it and then set it down beside the man he'd just killed, rather than putting it back where he got it. People aren't always rational after— "No," she agreed pleasantly. "They're not? Thank you, Inspector." She walked home through the fog. The onions had gone soft by the time she reached her cottage, but she didn't particularly mind. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at her garden. The last of the asters still hanging on, brown-edged, and thought about Arthur Pendleton's shoes. New shoes for a confession, not for a crime. The crime had been, if it had been, Tuesday night in the fog. But the shoes were new today, each Wednesday morning, when he came to tell people about it. Men who committed murders in a rage did not go home, sleep on it, and come in the next morning in new shoes. They came in looking grey and destroyed, or they didn't come in at all. Miss Jane put the onions in the bin and sliced fresh ones. He dressed for this, she thought again. And then, more quietly, why does a man dress well to confess to a murder he didn't commit? She didn't have the answer yet, but she thought about Vera Pendleton's Victoria sponge, which was always slightly better than it needed to be, the sort of effort a woman made when she was trying very hard to seem normal, and she thought she might pay a visit tomorrow. The fog thickened outside. Somewhere down the lane a door shut. Gerald Frome was dead. Arthur Pendleton had confessed to killing him, and the thing that bothered Miss Jane most, the thing she couldn't quite set aside, was the candlestick on the floor. Not replaced, not taken, just wiped and dropped beside the body like an afterthought. Whoever had done that had been in a hurry, or frightened, or both. Arthur Pendleton, walking into the police station in new shoes with a story he'd told smoothly and without hesitation, had not been frightened of anything. Vera Pendleton answered the door in her good blouse. This was, Miss Jane noted, the second wardrobe choice in this household that didn't quite fit the occasion. A woman whose husband had just confessed to murder ought to be in whatever she'd slept in. Or at best, something pulled on quickly without thought. The good blouse, cream with small pearl buttons pressed, suggested she had been expecting visitors, who had been expecting perhaps to be looked at. Miss Hartley. Vera's face did something complicated. How kind of you to come. I won't stay long, Miss Jane said, which was not quite a lie, and not quite the truth. I only wanted to see how you were managing. The cottage was tidy. Too tidy, possibly, for a Wednesday morning after the night Vera had presumably had. But then some women cleaned when they were frightened, and some women had always been tidy, and Miss Jane couldn't read too much into a swept floor. She was given tea in the sitting room. The fire was lit. On the mantelpiece, Miss Jane noted the mantelpiece without appearing to, there were photographs, a clock, 2 china dogs, and a small brass dish for keys. No candlesticks. It must have been a terrible shock, Miss Jane said. Vera's hands were around her cup. Yes. When did you find out? This morning. A constable came. She looked at the fire. He was very young. Didn't quite know what to say. They rarely do. Miss Jane set down her cup. Arthur must have been under a great deal of strain, with the rent situation and everything. Something moved across Vera's face, brief, controlled. He was. Gerald Frome was not an easy man to be indebted to. No. Vera's voice was careful now in the way that voices got when a person was listening to themselves speak. He wasn't. Still, Miss Jane looked at the china dogs with the expression she used for looking at things she wasn't really looking at. I imagine you'll want to get a solicitor organized. Colworth is a reasonable man. I've found him sensible, on the whole. I've already telephoned one, Vera said. She said it quickly, then seemed to hear how quickly she'd said it. A slight adjustment in her expression. Well, Miss Jane said warmly, very sensible. You're managing very well, all things considered. Vera looked at her then. Not the bright, managing smile, something underneath it. Something that was almost gratitude and almost something else. I'm trying to, she said. Miss Jane stayed another 10 minutes and talked about the weather and the state of the lane after last week's rain, and whether the Harvest Festival Committee would manage to agree on anything before Christmas. Vera answered everything correctly. She was a composed woman, Vera Pendleton. Whatever she was holding inside herself, she held it very evenly. It was only at the door, as Miss Jane was pulling on her gloves, that she said, as though it had just occurred to her, such a frightening thing, to be alone in the house, knowing what Arthur had. Well, she shook her head gently. I imagine you didn't sleep. Vera's hand was on the doorframe. I didn't, no. Tuesday nights are always quiet here, aren't they? Nothing much moving. Nothing at all, Vera said. I didn't hear a thing all evening. Miss Jane smiled and said goodbye. She walked down the path. Behind her she heard the door close, not slammed, not shut with relief, just closed, and she thought about what Vera had said without being asked. I didn't hear a thing all evening. Not I was at home. Not I was worried about Arthur, just I didn't hear anything. A woman who had nothing to account for didn't account for herself. Mrs. as Drummond had been postmistress at Cranswick-on-Mere for 31 years, and knew, as Miss Jane once told a bemused D.I. Colworth, more about the private lives of the village than anyone had any right to. She also knew when to talk and when to be quiet, which was why she had survived 31 years in the position without anyone taking active steps to remove her. She was sorting parcels when Miss Jane came in. The post office was warm and smelled of brown paper and the peppermints Mrs. Drummond kept in a dish on the counter. "Terrible business," Mrs. Drummond said without preamble, before Miss Jane had fully closed the door. "Isn't it? Can't say I'm surprised." She set down a parcel. "About Gerald Frome, I mean. Not about Arthur. Arthur surprises me considerably." "Does he?" Miss Jane examined a display of rubber bands near the counter. "In what way?" Mrs. Drummond lowered her voice, which in the empty post office was unnecessary but habitual. "Arthur Pendleton is not a violent man. I've known him 12 years. He's the sort of man who apologizes when you bump into him. Gerald Frome could say whatever liked to Arthur, and Arthur would have gone home and been polite about it. People do sometimes snap. They do." Mrs. Drummond didn't sound convinced. "Still—" Miss Jane looked up from the rubber bands. "What do you know about Gerald's arrangements with the village, I mean?" A pause. Mrs. Drummond's expression shifted into something that was professionally neutral, and personally very interested. "With what sort of arrangements?" "The sort that aren't entirely above board." Another pause. Mrs. Drummond came around the counter and checked unnecessarily that the door to the street was properly shut. "Gerald Frome," she said in a lower register, "had a very particular habit. He paid attention, more attention than people realized." She straightened a stack of forms on the counter. "He knew things about people. Small things, some of them. Other things not so small. And he used them. Not always, that was the clever part." She looked at the forms. "Sometimes he just held them. Let people know he knew, without ever saying so outright. So they never quite felt they could make trouble for him. Over the rent or the repairs or anything else. And sometimes—" Mrs. Drummond picked up a peppermint from the dish. "Sometimes there were people who could be more useful to him than others. And with those people, yes, he was more direct. Do you know who?" "I know some." She was quiet for a moment. "The Hendersons, over on Mill Road, had some trouble with their planning permissions a few years back. Something that should have cost them a great deal of money somehow didn't. Gerald had a friendship with someone on the council, apparently. After that, the Hendersons were very accommodating when Gerald needed their field for his shooting parties." She paused. "And there was a woman, I won't say who, whose son had done something rather stupid when he was 19. Gerald knew about it. She cleaned his house for 3 years without pay." Miss Jane was quiet. "As for Arthur Pendleton," Mrs. Drummond said carefully, I don't know exactly what Gerald had on him. But I know that when Arthur lost his position in Norwich, Gerald was the one who lent him money. And the terms were, well, people talked." She looked at Miss Jane directly. "People said that if Arthur had tried to leave the cottage, or make any difficulty about the rent, Gerald would have made things very awkward indeed." "What sort of awkward?" "I don't know the details." She put the peppermint back, untasted. "But I know that Vera Pendleton has been afraid of Gerald Frome for at least 2 years. You can see fear in a person when you've been watching people long enough. You can see it in how carefully they behave." Miss Jane thought of Vera's composed face over the teacup, the good blouse. The solicitor already telephoned. "One more thing," she said. "Gerald's solicitor, Noel Ashby. Do you know him well?" Mrs. Drummond's expression did something that was not quite a smile. "Well enough. He used to collect his post here before he moved his office to Marlingham. A careful man. very tidy, very keen on knowing what other people were doing. She paused. He and Gerald were close, closer than a solicitor and client usually are. Business? Business, she agreed. Then there was some talk a few years ago about land. The Meryton parcel, you know it, the fields that run up behind St. Bride's Lane. Planning permissions were changing, and there was money to be made if you knew early enough. Ashby would have known. Gerald would have had the capital. She straightened up. Nothing ever came of the talk, but talk doesn't usually start from nothing. No, said Miss Jane. It doesn't. She bought a book of stamps she didn't need and went back out into the November cold. She almost missed Tommy Fitch entirely. He was coming out of the churchyard gate as she was passing, a young man 20 or so, with the particular look of someone who works outdoors and thinks indoors, and is not always comfortable in either place. He had been Gerald Frome's gardener and odd-job man for the past 3 years. Miss Jane knew him as she knew most of the village. By sight, by name, by the general outline of his situation. He saw her and something crossed his face. He would have walked past, she thought. He was inclined to, but she said pleasantly, "Tommy, you've heard the news, I suppose?" He stopped. "Yes, Miss Hartley." "Dreadful thing." She looked at him with the mild, unfocused attention that put people off their guard. "You must have known Mr. Frome quite well, working for him. Well enough." His voice was careful. "And Tuesday evenings you worked late sometimes, didn't you? I seem to remember seeing the light in the shed on a Tuesday night in the autumn." Something shifted, just slightly, in his shoulders or around his eyes. "Sometimes," he said. "Not this past Tuesday, I imagine, with the fog." He was quiet for a moment too long. I left early that evening," he said, and then, as though he needed to confirm it, early, before it got dark. Miss Jane looked at him pleasantly. He was not a good liar, Tommy Fitch. He had an honest face that went wrong when it tried to be otherwise. A slight tightness, a too deliberate stillness. "Well," she said, "it's all in hand now, I expect. It's with Arthur Pendleton having come forward." She watched his face. "Resolved very neatly." "Yes," Tommy said. And then, almost involuntarily, "I suppose so." He said goodbye and went off down the lane quickly, his hands in his pockets. Miss Jane watched him go. "I suppose so. Not yes, not what a relief. Just, I suppose so." The answer of a person who doesn't quite believe the resolution on offer, but hasn't decided yet what to do about that. She would need to talk to him properly. Not on the street, not like this. Somewhere he felt less watched. She walked home the long way, through the churchyard, past the old yews with their wet bark and the graves that had been there long enough to stop being sad about. November light, the colour of old silver. Somewhere rooks were arguing in the elm trees. Arthur Pendleton, in new shoes, is saying, "I want to be honest about it." Vera Pendleton, in her good blouse, not asked and yet accounting for her evening. Tommy Fitch, leaving early, before dark, on a foggy Tuesday. And Noel Ashby, careful Noel Ashby, who had known things and held them, who had been close to Gerald Frome in a way that was more than professional, walking in and out of this picture in a way she couldn't quite see yet. She needed to see it. The shed at the bottom of Gerald Frome's garden was unlocked. Miss Jane had not planned to go there. She had planned to walk past the lane end, confirm the general geography in her mind, and go home for lunch. But the gate was open, left so by whoever had been in and out of the property since Wednesday morning, and the garden was empty. And she had always found that places told you things that people wouldn't. She went in. The shed smelled of creosote and damp earth, and the particular cold smell of metal tools left in winter air. Rakes and spades hung in a line along one wall with the neatness of a person who took their work seriously. A workbench along the opposite wall had a vise, various tins of screws and nails arranged by size, a coil of wire, a pair of heavy gloves left palm down, as though their owner had meant to come back for them. Tommy's gloves, presumably. Miss Jane stood in the shed doorway and looked not at the shed but at what the shed looked out upon. The side gate, a wooden thing, green paint peeling, that opened onto Friar's Path, the narrow cut-through that ran between Gerald's property and the Hendersons' field. From where she stood she could see it clearly. Could see, also, the back of the house, the study window, the yellow light that would have been visible on a dark November evening. The path between gate and back door that was perhaps 30 feet of gravel. So, a person coming in through the side gate on a foggy Tuesday evening would have been visible from this shed. Clearly visible if there was a light on inside. She looked at the workbench again. On the lower shelf, almost out of sight, there was a receipt from Caldwell's Hardware in Marlingham, dated 4 weeks ago, a tin of varnish and a set of sandpaper. She looked at the projects nearby, a small stool with one leg newly replaced, the wood pale against the older finish. The stool had been worked on recently. The varnish tin was open and part used. Tommy had been here Tuesday evening. He had said he hadn't been. He had said he'd left early, before dark. He had lied, and not very well, and she needed to understand why. She found him at his mother's house on the Staveley Road. It was Thursday now, 2 days since the confession, and he was presumably between jobs, uncertain whether Gerald's property would still need tending given the circumstances. He answered the door himself, and went quite still when he saw her. "Miss Hartley!" "Tommy," she smiled, "I wonder if I might have a few minutes." He stepped back to let her in. The house was small and warm and smelled of something on the stove. And his mother, a stout, sensible woman who had once served on the school board when Miss Jane was still teaching, called from the kitchen, and then appeared in the doorway and said wasn't it dreadful about Gerald Frome, and did Miss Jane want tea? Miss Jane said yes to the tea and allowed herself to be settled at the kitchen table. Tommy sat across from her, with his hands flat on the table, watching her with the wariness of a person who knows they are about to be asked something. She waited until his mother had gone back to the stove. "I've been thinking," Miss Jane said quietly, "about what a difficult position a young man might find himself in, knowing something, not being certain whether he ought to say it." Tommy looked at the table. "The difficulty," she went on in the same conversational tone, "is that staying quiet is only safe when the right person has been caught. When the wrong person has been caught well, then staying quiet becomes quite a different thing, doesn't it?" A long pause. "I don't know that the wrong person has been caught," he said. "But he said it to the table, not to her. Don't you?" He was quiet for a while. His mother stirred something. Outside a bicycle went past on the lane. "If I say something," he said at last, "and it turns out, if people find out I was there, they'll wonder why I didn't say something Wednesday morning, first thing." "Yes," Miss Jane said, "they will wonder that." "And I couldn't very well say that someone had—" He stopped, pressed his lips together, started again. "The day after, Wednesday morning, someone telephoned here, told my mother I should keep to myself what I'd seen, said there were ways of making trouble for a person, for our family. He looked up then, for the first time. His face was younger than his age when he was frightened. My mother doesn't know what it was about. I told her it was a wrong number. Miss Jane looked at him steadily. And what had you seen? He took a breath. I was in the shed Tuesday evening, working on that stool, the one in the corner with the new leg. I lost track of time, got absorbed in it. A pause. It was dark when I looked up. 8:30, I think, maybe 8:45. I was about to pack up when I heard the gate, the side gate onto Friar's Path. And you saw someone. A man, he looked down again, coming through the gate onto the path, walking toward the back of the house, quickly. He didn't look around. I don't think he saw me. The shed light was off by then. I turned it off when I heard the gate. A pause. He knocked at the back door. The study light was on. After a bit, the door opened and he went inside. Did you recognize him? A very long pause. It was Mr. Ashby, he said quietly. Noel Ashby, the solicitor from Marlingham? Miss Jane said nothing. I know him because he came twice to the house when I was working there. In the autumn, he and Mr. Frome would go into the study, and I'd be told to stay in the garden. He looked at the table. He came in a car usually, but Tuesday night he came on foot through the back gate. And the telephone call the next morning. I don't know that it was him, Tommy said quickly. I don't know that. No, she agreed. You don't. She looked at the boy across the table, 20 years old, alone with something he didn't know what to do with, made to feel that knowing it was dangerous. Outside, the stove popped and settled. Tommy, she said, are you willing to tell D.I. Colworth what you've told me? Will it? He stopped. Will they do something, if I say it? I believe so. Yes. He nodded slowly. Just once. So then his mother came back with the tea and said, wasn't the fog lifting at last? She thought she could see the field from the upstairs window. And Tommy looked at Miss Jane across the table with the expression of someone who has just stepped off a ledge and is waiting to see what happens next. She sat with it that evening. The handedness had been in her mind since the station, since Colworth had mentioned, without realizing the significance, that the wound was on the left temporal region. She had been carrying it the way she sometimes carried things, not quite looking at it directly, letting it settle. That evening she sat in her chair by the fire and let it come clear. Arthur Pendleton had reached for his teacup that morning in the station with his right hand. A simple thing, she had noticed it without meaning to, and the habit of a lifetime of noticing. He was right-handed. Firmly so, the way people were when there'd never been any confusion about it. A right-handed man standing in front of another man, standing across from him as one would stand in an argument, would strike with his right hand. The natural arc of that blow would land on the right side of the victim's head. To strike the left side, a right-handed man would need to be standing at an odd angle, or behind his victim, or reach across in a way that would be awkward and unnatural in the middle of a heated argument. The wound was on the left, which meant either Gerald had been turned away, possible, but Gerald Frome was not the sort of man who turned his back on an argument, or the person who struck him was left-handed. Vera Pendleton was left-handed. She had seen it. When? It was 2 days ago, at the cottage. Vera sitting across from her with her teacup, setting it down, reaching into the small bag beside her chair for a handkerchief, folding it. Left hand, all of it. The natural dominance of a lifetime. So, Vera was left-handed. Vera had been afraid of Gerald Frome for 2 years. Gerald had been blackmailing them, or holding something at minimum that made the Pendletons afraid to act. And Vera had said, without being asked, that she hadn't heard anything Tuesday evening, which meant she was constructing an account of her whereabouts before anyone had asked for one, which meant— Miss Jane stopped. She put down her knitting. Vera had said, "I didn't hear a thing all evening." But Tommy had seen Ashby go in at 9:15. Arthur claimed to have gone at 9. Even if either was true, if anyone had been there that evening making any kind of noise, Larkspur Cottage was 4 streets away. Vera couldn't have heard anything regardless. It was not the kind of statement that needed making, unless Vera was not accounting for what she had heard, unless Vera was accounting for where she had been. She walked to the Hendersons the following morning. Not to see the Hendersons, she was not particularly friendly with the Hendersons, but because Mrs. Holt lived in the adjoining cottage, and Mrs. Holt had mentioned to Mrs. Drummond at the post office counter last spring that she and Vera Pendleton played bridge on Tuesday evenings when they could manage a fourth. Mrs. Holt was a small, bright-eyed woman who answered the door in gardening gloves and seemed pleased to have a reason to stop what she was doing. Tuesday? She pulled off her gloves. Yes, Vera was here. We had a full table for once. Mrs. Holt's daughter was visiting. We played until past 10, I think. Why? Just curious, Miss Jane said. You know how people talk. Someone had mentioned seeing her out. Not on Tuesday, Mrs. Holt said firmly. She was here from 8. I remember because she arrived just as we finished supper, and I hadn't quite cleared. She paused. Is everything all right? With Arthur, I mean. It's all so dreadful. It is, Miss Jane agreed. Thank you, Mrs. Holt. I won't keep you from your garden. She walked back up the lane. Vera had been at Mrs. Holt's from 8 until past 10, which meant she had not gone to Gerald Frome's house, which meant the wound and the handedness and the arranged alibi were all pieces of different puzzles, and she had been trying to put them into the same picture. She had been wrong about Vera. She stopped on the lane and stood for a moment in the cold air, and allowed herself to be wrong about it, which was important, she had always thought. You had to let yourself be wrong properly, not just gloss over it and move forward, or you carried the error with you. Vera Pendleton had been at a bridge game. Arthur Pendleton was right-handed. Noel Ashby had gone in through the back gate at 9:15. And someone had telephoned Tommy Fitch the morning after and told him to keep quiet. The picture shifted, rearranged itself, and then, quite suddenly, in the way that things sometimes did when you had stopped pushing at them, it came clear. She needed to see Vera once more. She went on Friday afternoon, unannounced, and with a tin of shortbread she had made that morning. A reasonable excuse, the kind of thing neighbours did. Vera answered the door in ordinary clothes this time, a grey cardigan, her hair less carefully arranged than Wednesday. This was better. This was closer to the truth of things. They sat in the same room, same chairs, the fire lower today. The tin sat on the table between them, and Vera opened it and took a piece and held it without eating it. The solicitor has been, Vera said. He thinks Arthur may be able to— Well, he wasn't encouraging exactly, but he wasn't discouraging. These things take time, Miss Jane said. Yes. She turned the shortbread in her fingers. The house is very quiet without him. Miss Jane looked at the china dogs on the mantelpiece. It must be strange, not knowing quite what to do with yourself. I keep starting things, then stopping. Vera set the shortbread down on the edge of the saucer. I sorted through some of Gerald's. Well, he had papers, things of Arthur's. We had asked for them back months ago. Papers? Documents, an agreement he'd made with Gerald over the loan. She smoothed her cardigan. I thought it was best to have them now, while I had the chance. A small pause. They were in his desk. Miss Jane kept her eyes on the china dogs. Did the police not take everything from the study? Not everything. They took what they thought was relevant. Vera's voice was carefully measured. These were personal papers. Arthur's name on them. I didn't think it was. I went and collected them. That was sensible, Miss Jane said pleasantly. And when was this? Tuesday night. The words came out levelly, but Vera's hand had stopped moving on her cardigan. After I heard about Gerald. Of course, Miss Jane said. She turned from the mantelpiece and looked at Vera with her mild, slightly unfocused gaze. Which drawer were they in? Only, I imagine the study was rather dark if you went late. A pause. Small, but there. The second drawer, Vera said. On the left side. It wasn't locked. Miss Jane nodded slowly and looked back at the fire. The second drawer. She had not mentioned drawers. She had said only Gerald's desk, an ordinary innocent question about the dark. Vera had answered a question she hadn't been asked. And had answered it precisely. Not the desk drawer or one of the drawers, but the second drawer, on the left side, with the particular knowledge of someone who had been told where to look. Because no one who had gone to a dead man's study, in the dark, alone and frightened, to find documents among many documents, would remember which drawer they were in, unless they had known in advance. Unless someone had told them. Unless there had been a note. The second drawer on the left. A note, an anonymous note, telling Vera exactly where Arthur's papers were, telling her to come and get them while she had the chance. And Vera, afraid for Arthur, had gone, had left Mrs. Holt's bridge game. No, she had an alibi. Mrs. Holt had been clear, had gone some other time. Wednesday, perhaps, or Thursday, and had left her fingerprints. That was the point, not to give Vera the documents. Gerald was dead. The loan agreement died with its enforcement, more or less. Whatever happened legally. The documents were not the point. The fingerprints were the point. Vera Pendleton's fingerprints in Gerald Frome's study, around his desk. Evidence of her presence there, in proximity to a murder scene, placed without Vera ever understanding that was what she was doing. Miss Jane sat with the shortbread tin on the table between them and thought, how very cold. Because it meant whoever sent that note had planned against contingency. If Arthur's confession held, Vera's fingerprints were irrelevant. No one would look. But if the confession fell apart, if someone looked more closely, there was Vera. Left-handed Vera with her fingerprints in the dead man's study and a motive anyone could establish. A reserve, a backup, a second confession waiting in the wings. And only one person had known Arthur would confess. Had relied on it. Had in fact engineered the situation, so that Arthur would have no other choice. The blackmail, the debt, the accumulated pressure that made Gerald's death into something Arthur Pendleton would feel responsible for, whether or not he had done it. A man that honourable, with a wife that afraid, the confession was predictable, almost inevitable. The note to Vera was insurance. It must have been a relief, Miss Jane said, to have those papers safe. Yes, Vera said quietly. It was. I imagine you'll burn them. Vera looked at her then, sharply, for just a moment. I hadn't thought about it. Miss Jane smiled and finished her tea and said she mustn't take up any more of Vera's afternoon. She went to Colworth on Friday evening. But he was still at the station. He kept long hours, Colworth, which she respected. And he looked up when Briggs showed her in, with the expression of a man who has had a long week and suspects it is about to become longer. Miss Hartley. "I'm sorry to come late," she said, sitting down across from his desk. "I wanted to be certain before I came." Something in his face settled, shifted. He put down his pen. "Certain of what?" "That I wasn't wasting your time." She looked at her hands in her lap for a moment. Arthur Pendleton didn't kill Gerald Frome. Colworth was quiet. Outside the station, someone went past on a bicycle, the wheel needing oil, a faint rhythmic complaint fading down the lane. "He confessed," Colworth said. "He confessed to protect his wife." She looked up. He believed Vera had done it, but he had reason to believe it. Gerald had been blackmailing them, or near enough, and Vera had motive and fear enough to act. Arthur came home, I don't know exactly when, found Gerald dead, assumed Vera, and by the next morning had decided to confess. She paused. "He loves her very much, I think. People do rather extraordinary things for that reason." Colworth looked at her steadily. "And you think Vera was at Mrs. Holt's house from 8 until past 10 on Tuesday evening. 4 witnesses, if you count the daughter who was visiting." She waited a moment. "She didn't do it either." He leaned back in his chair. "Then who?" "Noel Ashby." She said it simply. "He went in through the side gate at 8:45 on Tuesday evening." "I have a witness, Tommy Fitch, Gerald's gardener who was working late in the shed. Tommy was telephoned the following morning by someone who told him to say nothing, which is why he's said nothing until today." She looked at Colworth directly. "He's willing to make a statement." Colworth was very still. "Ashby and Gerald had a business arrangement," she continued. "The Meryton land parcel. I believe, if you look carefully at the planning permissions and the land registry records over the past 3 years, you'll find something that both men would have preferred stayed quiet. Gerald had apparently decided to take the whole profit and use his knowledge of Ashby's involvement to ensure Ashby's silence." She paused. "A man like Gerald Frome would see that as elegant. A man like Ashby would see it as intolerable. This is Miss Hartley. This is a great deal of inference," she agreed, "mostly. But Tommy's testimony is not inference. And there is one other thing." She told him about the note to Vera, about the second drawer, about fingerprints placed with precision, and Vera's slip of knowledge she had no innocent explanation for knowing. Someone told her where to go and what to take. That someone needed her fingerprints in that room. That is not inference, that is a plan, and it is Ashby's kind of plan. Careful, layered, accounting for contingency. Colworth looked at the desk between them. "You've been busy," he said, not unkindly. "I've been walking," she said. "I walk a great deal. One notices things." He was quiet for a while. She could see him setting things against each other in his mind. The shape of it, whether it held, where the weak points were. He was a methodical man, Colworth. She liked that about him. "The land records," he said finally. "If there's something there, there will be. A man doesn't silence a gardener over a social visit." Another long pause. Then he reached for his pen, set it down again, reached for his notepad. "I'll want Tommy Fitch here first thing tomorrow," he said. "I told him to expect a telephone call." Colworth looked at her. "And Vera Pendleton's fingerprints, if they're on file, or if we can get a comparison without—" "She touched the shortbread tin," Miss Jane said. She reached into her bag and set it on the desk. "I haven't touched the lid since she did." He stared at the tin. She stood up and buttoned her coat and pulled on her gloves. "One thing," she said at the door. "Arthur, the false confession. He was protecting his wife. I imagine you'll use your judgment about how to proceed." Colworth was still looking at the tin. "I generally do," he said. "Yes," she said, "I know. That's why I came to you." She went out into the Friday night, cold and clear now. The fog finally lifted, stars showing between the church tower and the old yews. Her breath came in small clouds. The village was quiet. Lights in windows, smell of wood smoke, someone's wireless playing something low and indistinct from behind a curtain. Gerald Frome had used people for years, had held their small shames and private fears like counters on a board, moving them when he needed to, leaving them in place when he didn't. And Noel Ashby had watched him do it, had perhaps done some of it himself, and had finally decided, when Gerald turned the same instrument on him, that he had had enough. She understood it. She didn't excuse it, but she understood it. What she found harder to understand, what sat with her as she walked home through the quiet village, was the note. The second drawer on the left. Vera's fingerprints, placed without her knowledge or consent, held in reserve against a future need. That was not a crime of anger or desperation. That was a man sitting down, after committing a murder, and thinking carefully about who else he could arrange to take the blame if necessary. That was colder than she liked to think about. She turned up the path to her cottage. The light was on in the hall. She'd left it burning. The asters in the garden were invisible in the dark, but she knew they were there. Noel Ashby was arrested on Saturday morning. Miss Jane heard about it from Mrs. Drummond, who had heard it from the butcher's boy, who had apparently been making a delivery on the Marlingham Road, when two police cars went past at a speed that the Marlingham Road did not usually see. By 11 o'clock the news had moved through the village in the way that news did, post office to pub to church hall to kitchen table, acquiring small embellishments at each stop, a few of which were probably true. She heard it and felt something she always felt at this point. Not satisfaction exactly, something quieter and less comfortable than satisfaction. Arthur Pendleton was released on Saturday afternoon. She saw them from her garden gate, Vera and Arthur, coming back up the lane in the thin November light, Vera's hand through Arthur's arm. They walked slowly. Arthur looked smaller than she remembered, though that was probably the coat, a grey one that was slightly too large in the shoulders. Vera looked at the ground as they walked. They passed her gate. Arthur looked up. He stopped. "Miss Hartley," he said. He said it the way people said a thing when they knew more than they were saying. When they had been told, or had guessed, or had worked it through the long hours of waiting and arrived at a name. "Mr. Pendleton," she said, "I'm glad to see you home." He looked at her for a moment. His face had changed from Wednesday. The careful steadiness was gone, and what was underneath was tiredness and something else. Relief mostly, but also a kind of shame, which she thought well of him for feeling. "Thank you," he said quietly, as though the words meant more than their face value, which they did. Vera looked up then. Her eyes were red-rimmed. She not from fresh crying, but from the accumulated crying of several days. She looked at Miss Jane and seemed about to say something, and then seemed to decide that there wasn't anything adequate to say, which was also the right instinct. "Go home," Miss Jane said kindly. "Have some tea, light the fire." They went on up the lane. She watched them go, Arthur's shoulders slightly bent, Vera's hand still through his arm, the two of them moving through the pale afternoon light with the careful closeness of people who have nearly lost each other and not yet quite caught up with the fact of still being together. She went back to her roses. The winter pruning was satisfying work, methodical, each cut deliberate, no slashing, no guessing. You looked at the cane, judged it, cut cleanly above the right bud and moved on. The secateurs were good ones, Iggy Sheffield steel, kept sharp. Her father had given them to her 30 years ago, and she had never felt the need for others. She worked her way along the bed. The garden was almost entirely brown now. The asters finally gone, the dahlias lifted and stored, the grass long past needing cutting. What remained was the bare structure of things, the shapes of the beds without their contents. She liked the garden in November. There was an honesty to it. She had reached the 4th rose, a blush-pink climber that went up the east side of the garden wall, and was, in summer, entirely excessive and magnificent beasa, when she heard the gate. Mrs. Drummond came up the path with the expression of someone who has been patient for as long as they can reasonably manage. "I won't stay," she said, staying. She looked at the rosebed, then at Miss Jane. "Yeah, Tommy Fitch has been asking if you'll be needing him for any gardening work." A pause. "I think he feels rather strongly that he'd like to do something useful for someone. Tell him I'll need the leaves cleared from the back beds next week," Miss Jane said, "and the ivy is getting out of hand on the far wall." Mrs. Drummond nodded. Then, because she could not help it, "Remarkable, Miss Hartley. How you knew where to look." Miss Jane straightened up, considered the question properly, as it deserved. "I didn't know where to look," she said. "Not at first. I knew something was wrong before I knew what it was. The confession." "The shoes," she said, "and then the confession, yes, but—" She paused, looking at the rose cane she was holding. "I've spent 30 years watching children, teaching children, in which is really the same thing. You're always watching. And one thing I learned, very early on, is that when a child volunteers a confession too quickly, when they come to you before you've even asked, they are almost never the one who broke the window." Mrs. Drummond waited. "They're protecting someone," Miss Jane said. "Someone they love, a friend, a sibling, someone they have decided matters more than whatever happens to them." She set down the secateurs. "So the question is never who confessed. That tells you very little. The question is always, why did they want to? What were they protecting? And then you follow the love." She picked up the secateurs again. "It leads you, eventually, to the truth, and then, usually, to whoever didn't want you to reach it." Mrs. Drummond was quiet for a moment. A rook called somewhere in the elms. The afternoon light was going already, the sky over the church tower shading into that particular grey-white of winter dusk that was not quite beautiful and not quite bleak. "And Ashby?" Mrs. Drummond said at last. When did you know it was him?" "When Tommy told me he'd been there," she said. "Before that, I had pieces without a centre. After that, I had a centre without enough pieces. It was the drawer that gave me the rest." The drawer. Vera knew which drawer the documents were in. She had no innocent explanation for knowing that. She clipped a dead cane cleanly at the base. Someone had told her, and that someone had done so in order to place her at the scene, her fingerprints, her presence, in case Arthur's confession fell apart. It was an extremely cold and deliberate thing to do. Mrs. Drummond hugged her coat closer. "What sort of man does that?" Miss Jane was quiet for a moment. "A frightened one," she said finally, "which doesn't excuse it." But Gerald Frome had turned on him, had decided that Ashby was more useful as a liability than a partner. And Ashby had spent years watching Gerald hold things over people, knowing that when it was his turn, he had no ground to stand on. She looked at the rose wall. Fear and intelligence together can make people very calculating, very cold. A pause. It's one of the more dangerous combinations. She went back to the pruning. Mrs. Drummond stood for a few minutes more, then said she ought to get back, and then went down the path with the satisfied step of a woman who has the most important piece of this week's news and knows exactly what to do with it. The gate clicked shut. Miss Jane worked on. The last rose was a dark red climber. She had never known its proper name, had bought it from a market stall 20 years ago from a man who'd called it simply a burgundy climber and hadn't known more. And by the time it was established, she had stopped caring what it was called. It grew strongly and bloomed late, and dropped its petals all at once, so that the fall, when it came, was sudden and complete. She pruned it carefully, kept what was strong, removed what wasn't. Gerald Frome's garden would go untended for a while, she supposed. Then Sylvia would sell. She would sell, Miss Jane was fairly certain of it. Sylvia had never looked like a woman who wanted to stay. And someone else would take it on. And in a few years, it would be someone else's garden with someone else's arrangement of things. And the particular history of the last 11 years would be absorbed into the village's longer, slower memory. That was how it went. Villagers were patient with their histories. They held them loosely and kept moving. She gathered the cut canes and carried them to the barrow. Her hands were cold, she had forgotten gloves, and her knees were making their usual commentary about prolonged kneeling. She straightened up slowly and looked at the bed she had finished. The roses neat and bare now, just the good strong canes left, everything else cut away. In spring, they would grow as though none of this had happened, and she found that comforting rather than troubling. The seasons didn't know about Gerald Frome and Noel Ashby, and the brass candlestick, and the second drawer on the left. They simply went on. The roses would come back, as they always did, the blush pink first, then the burgundy climber. And somewhere up the lane, Vera and Arthur Pendleton would be sitting by their fire, and Tommy Fitch would be doing someone's garden, and Mrs. Drummond would be sorting parcels and knowing things. And the village would turn again toward the particular quality of December cold that always came before the first frost. The light was nearly gone now. She wheeled the barrow to the corner of the garden and went inside. The kettle took a few minutes. She stood at the window while she waited and watched the garden go dark, the roses invisible now, just the shape of the wall and the old yew at the far end, and the first stars appearing over the church tower. She made her tea, plain, no milk, and sat in the chair by the fire with her knitting, and thought about nothing in particular for a little while, which was its own kind of pleasure. The fire settled. The knitting needles made their small, steady sound. Outside, the village was quiet. End.